Think for a moment about some action you've done that you would consider to be morally good or morally right. It doesn't have to be hugely heroic, it could just be something small. Maybe you spent a few afternoons on some Saturdays during some semester volunteering at a homeless shelter. Maybe you went and visited an aging relative whose day you could make brighter, despite the fact that it may have been a kind of emotional burden for you to do that. Um, Now consider, on the other hand, an example of something you've done where you think that was morally wrong. Again, it doesn't have to be extremely grave. Maybe you lied to somebody, and you look back and think, "Boy, I shouldn't have told that lie." Maybe you made an unkind remark in a context where you were just frustrated, but it really hurt somebody's feelings. Maybe you cheated on a test and you regret it. Whatever your example is, I want you to step back and ask this question: what makes an action morally right, and what makes an action morally wrong? Is there anything general that we can say about the difference between right actions and wrong actions? We're going to look at a couple of moral theories today. Broadly, we can distinguish between consequentialist moral theories and non consequentialist moral theories. Consequentialist moral theories basically say that the rightness or wrongness of an action depends on the consequences. Does it make good consequences or cause good consequences? And does it cause bad consequences? And what is the net sum of the goods and bads? The main form of consequentialist moral theory historically, that's most influential and I think most plausible, is utilitarianism. There are non utilitarian consequentialisms. We will focus, though, on utilitarianism as our main example of a consequentialist theory. Non consequentialist theories, by contrast, say, look, maybe consequences are morally relevant, but that's not all there is to right and wrong. It also matters what the intentions of the actor were when they were doing the action. It matters whether their emotions were correct. Were they expressing hatred, for example? Were they expressing compassion? Those things, according to non consequentialist theories, also matter. We'll be talking about Kantianism, which is one of the main non consequentialist theories. And according to Kantianism, there are certain actions that are always off limits, even if they can produce good consequences, because they inherently express, according to Kant, a disregard for the humanity of other people. So we will be discussing utilitarianism and Kantianism. Consequentialism, broadly speaking, is a family of moral theories. We can try to state it a little more precisely. I mentioned that it says that the rightness or wrongness of an action depends entirely on good and bad consequences. Here's how we can put it with more precision. An action is morally right if and only if it produces the best consequences compared to anything else you could do in the circumstances. What this is saying is that if you're choosing between options A and B, the thing to consider is which of these two produces the best balance of good and bad consequences. I mean, if option A produces a bunch of bad consequences and not much good, whereas option B produces a ton of good and not much bad, consequentialism says the right thing to do is obviously the choice that produces the better consequences, option B. I mean, that almost sounds definitionally true. Do the better thing, right? Um, uh, One thing to note, though, immediately is that consequentialism is more like a framework, or a family or a schema that can be filled in by different details. And that's because consequentialism alone doesn't tell us what good consequences are and what bad consequences are. It just assumes we already understand that. So, in order to actually complete consequentialism and make it a more precise and full moral theory, we have to pair it with an account of what good consequences are and what bad consequences are. And the main example of a consequentialist moral theory that's filled out with these additional details with a theory of value is John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism. Here's what Mill says: pleasure and freedom from pain are the only things desirable as ends, and all desirable things are desirable either for the pleasure inherent in themselves or as a means to the promotion of pleasure and the prevention of pain. The doctrine that the basis of morals is utility, or the greatest happiness principle, holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, and wrong in proportion as they tend to promote the reverse of happiness. And then he clarifies, by happiness is intended pleasure in the absence of pain, by unhappiness, pain and the privation of pleasure. So what we have in Mill is a combination of the consequentialist framework, which says the right thing to do is to promote the best consequences, with a hedonistic theory of value, which says that the only intrinsic good is happiness or pleasure, and the only intrinsic bad is unhappiness or pain. When we combine these two, what we have is utilitarianism, which is a completed moral theory. It says an action is morally right if and only if it produces maximal net happiness. Now, what utilitarianism tells us is that the right thing to do is always the thing that leads to the highest possible balance out of all of the options you have of happiness or pleasure for all over unhappiness or pain for all. And the all here is important because this phrase maximal net happiness, it did appear in our last unit when we were discussing hedonism, and specifically the hedonistic theory of the good life. The hedonistic theory of the good life was, if you as an individual are trying to make your life better, the thing to do is to maximize net happiness for yourself, or maximize net pleasure for yourself. Utilitarianism is not just about your happiness. This is a moral theory. And so what it says is your pleasure and your pain do count, but they just count sort of once. There are a whole bunch of other bearers of pleasure and pain out there, and they count just as much as you. So an action is morally right if and only if it produces the most net happiness. And that for us is going to encompass all of the pleasure or happiness felt by anyone who could be affected by the action, and all of the pain felt by anyone who could be affected by the action. You have to add up all of that pleasure, subtract all of that pain in order to calculate what the net consequences are. And the thing to do is to choose the action that promotes the most happiness for the most people, roughly speaking. Our second moral theory comes to us from the German philosopher Immanuel Kant in his Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals. Kant begins by distinguishing between two kinds of imperatives. And an imperative you can think of as just roughly a statement about what one ought to do. It is a normative claim. It says something about what you should do or how you should behave. And he distinguishes between a hypothetical imperative and a categorical imperative. A hypothetical imperative says what one ought to do if one wants to achieve something else. So, for example, the other day I was on campus and somebody stopped me and said, how do I get to the stadium? And what I said was, well, you should turn left by the psychology building. Now, what I was saying there was hypothetical or conditional, in that I was assuming, based on his question, that he wanted to get to the stadium. And what I was saying to him was, if you want to get to the stadium, then you should turn left at the psychology building. Now, I wasn't claiming, regardless of what you want, you should turn left at the psychology building. I was saying, only if you want to get to the stadium should you turn left. So in that way, my imperative or my command or my exhortation to him, my ought, was conditional on his desire. And that desire, although it was present in him, of course, is not present in everyone. There were lots of people wandering around at exactly the same time who didn't want to get to the stadium. And I, of course, was restricting my ought to the people who wanted to get to the stadium, including and especially the person I was talking to, and not those other people. Likewise, the imperative, you should eat healthy if you want to lose weight, is conditional on your desire to lose weight. If you don't want to lose weight, then the imperative doesn't apply. or you should study if you want to do well in Philosophy 2010. I mean, in principle, if you don't care about how well you do in this class, then the exhortation or imperative, you should study, doesn't apply to you. Now, we of course would then probably have a conversation about whether you should also want to do well in Philosophy 2010, but even that would be conditional in nature. I would try to convince you by saying, well, don't you want to do well in your degree? Don't you want to get your degree? Don't you want to have a good GPA? Don't you care about philosophy and learning? All of those things I would be giving you or citing additional desires you have in order to help you feel the force of the should. Kant's idea is that none of those imperatives or oughts are, strictly speaking, moral. Those are, the way we could put it, is prudential. They're about the best way of achieving goals you have. Kant thinks he's an objectivist in the sense we used earlier this week. He thinks that if there is such a thing as a basic moral theory or expression of a basic moral rule that explained why the right actions are right and the wrong actions are wrong, it wouldn't be a hypothetical imperative. Morality has this quality of, so to speak, not caring about what your desires are. You know, if you are obligated or have a moral duty to do something, it doesn't really matter whether you want to or not. The obligation is still there. And that is the contrast with hypothetical imperatives. Kant defines a categorical imperative as follows. This is an imperative or an ought statement about what one ought to do that holds regardless of any other end you happen to want. And Kant's idea is that the moral ought or the moral should is a categorical imperative. Well, it's all well and good, you might think. Great. So what we're looking for in a moral theory ought to be, according to Kant, a categorical imperative, something that expresses what we should do regardless of our desires, that is therefore universal and not contingent on local customs or cultures. It is objective for Kant in that sense. But there's a big distance between that and, well, what actually is the content of the categorical imperative? Kant, in different places in the groundwork, formulates the categorical imperative differently. And by that, we just mean he's trying to get at the same fundamental rule, but he approaches it or puts it in different words in different places. We are going to focus on the second formulation of the categorical imperative. And Kant thinks the place really to start when we're thinking about the moral ought is not what are the consequences for overall happiness, but instead the place to start is to think about individual people, individual human beings, and to contrast them with mere objects. Here's what he says: beings whose existence rests not indeed on our will, but on nature, if they are non-rational beings, have only a relative worth as means and are therefore called things, whereas rational beings are called persons because their nature already marks them out as ends in themselves, that is, as something that may not be used merely as a means, and hence is an object of respect. These are therefore not merely subjective ends, the existence of which as effects of our action has a worth for us, but rather objective ends. So what's going on here is that Kant is noticing that we think all sorts of things have value, including objects. Like I'm looking right now at a Nintendo Switch that I desperately would like to be playing. That has value for me, but its value is not inherent in it. Instead, its value is bestowed, and it's bestowed by me. I make it as an end for myself by taking it to have value using my reason. I reason about that object and think it's good for me. I want it. Um, in that way, all things other that are not human beings themselves have value only insofar as they are valued by a reasoner. Kant is noticing that there's an important contrast between things that have value and the very sources of those values, namely human beings themselves. We, you and I, in virtue of having reason and being the sources of valuing, it doesn't make sense really to speak of us as having value for somebody or having value only relative to someone's desires. Instead, we are the very sources of desiring. And so we are, in that sense, ends in ourselves. And we are ends in ourselves because of this capacity we have to reason and take things to be good. Kant therefore says, because we are ends in ourselves, we are by our very nature things that may not be used merely as means. And the way he rephrases this is that we are objects of respect. Kant thinks that our reason, by making us ends in ourselves, bestows upon each of us as a human being a basic kind of inviolable dignity that demands to be treated with the respect that it deserves. He thinks this is really the basis of the categorical imperative, this insight he has about human beings as ends in themselves. He's like, if there's going to be a categorical imperative, it will have something to do with this unique feature of human beings as having unique dignity and autonomy in virtue of our reason. He says, if then there is to be a supreme practical principle and a categorical imperative, it must be such that it constitutes an objective principle of the will and hence can serve as a universal practical law. The ground of this principle is a rational nature exists and has an end in itself. So what he's saying here is that what we're really looking for the categorical imperative is something to ground it that doesn't vary from one person to the next. So it shouldn't be grounded in our desires, because what you desire might be different from what I desire. Instead, it should be grounded in something we have in common, which happens to be the fact that we are all reasoning beings. And Kant has just noted that that bestows upon us this inviolable dignity as ends in ourselves. That, he thinks, really has to work its way into our formulation of the categorical imperative. He then takes this insight and finally gives us what's sometimes called the principle of humanity, which is the second formulation of the categorical imperative. Act that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, always as an end, never merely as a means. That, he thinks, is the exceptionless command that we all, in virtue of being reasoning things, must respect, even if we don't want to. One thing to note about this is the humanity here, act that you treat humanity, really he means by humanity the capacity to reason. And he also says whether in your own person or in the person of any other. So he thinks that there are self-regarding duties. He thinks that self-harm, for example, is a way of disrespecting your own humanity. But he also thinks that because other people have reason just as much as we do, we equally owe that kind of respect to every other reasoner. And what that respect demands is that we treat them as if they are ends in themselves, because they are. In other words, we should never use people for our ends or treat them as if they were objects. Let's formulate Kantianism, therefore, as follows. An action is morally right if and only if it treats people as ends in themselves rather than as mere means to an end. What Kantianism forbids, first and foremost, is using people as things. That shows a deep disrespect for them. Instead, you must recognize in every interaction you have that each person is a basic source of value. Now, one thing to note here, just quickly, is that Kant is not saying you could never use another person in any context. Importantly, treating somebody as a means is not the same thing as treating them as a mere means. So, for example, if you have ever used DoorDash before, there's a clear sense in which you're using the DoorDash driver for an end you have, namely getting the food. The important thing, though, is that you're not violating the categorical imperative. You're not treating them as a mere means, so long as in your interaction with the DoorDash driver, you are also treating them as an end in themselves. And that means that you are recognizing that they are a person with their own ends and their own considerations and their own reason. If you greet them at the door, if you treat them respectfully, and then you tip them, you are, although using them, you're not treating them as a mere means. You wouldn't tip a car, just an empty car that's like automated or something that drops off your food, right? So as long as you're not treating the driver as if they were an automated object, you are not violating the categorical imperative. I mean, there's also the fact that they are agreeing with their own reason to be used as a means because they get something out of it too. So the important thing for Kant is not to treat people as a mere means in your interactions with them. We're going to talk about applying these two competing moral theories in the next segment to the trolley cases, but I do just want to note that Kant thinks that, notoriously, that one of the gravest moral wrongs one can do is lie. He thinks that no matter what the consequences are, good or bad, lying is always impermissible. Why? Well, because lying treats a person as a mere means. It treats them as if they weren't something that has reason just like you do. You are trying to bypass their reason by tricking them. Now, the utilitarian and more generally the consequentialist will say, hey, sometimes lying is impermissible, but sometimes it's not, right? It depends on what the consequences are. If somebody knocks on your door and says, I'm here to kill your roommate, are they here? The utilitarian would say, your duty is to lie to prevent that person from harming your friend. Kant would say, your duty is to tell the truth, which is counterintuitive in the extreme, but nevertheless, Kant thinks your duty first and foremost is to treat each person that you interact with as a reasoner. If the person ends up barging in and hurting your friend, it's on them. You have done what your duty is to humanity, both in yourself and to the other person.